There is a moment after the cameras shut off when a studio feels hollow, as if the walls themselves are exhaling. For decades, Dr. Phil McGraw walked confidently through that moment, surrounded by certainty, applause, and the belief that he understood human relationships better than most. Millions trusted him to untangle emotional chaos, to tell couples when love was worth saving and when it was already gone. But certainty has a shelf life, especially when it is worn daily like armor. By his 70s, long after the applause had lost its novelty, Dr. Phil was left with a quieter reality, one where the questions he once answered for others were now sitting unanswered inside his own home. For nearly 5 decades, Phil and Robin McGraw represented something rare in public life: stability. In a culture obsessed with scandal and collapse, their marriage appeared untouched by drama. 2 sons, grandchildren, shared projects, and a calm public presence created the impression of a relationship that had figured out the secret formula. People didn't just admire their marriage, they relied on it. It reassured audiences that love could last if done correctly. Yet longevity is not the same as intimacy, and endurance does not always mean fulfillment. What the public saw as strength was often structure, and structure, when mistaken for connection, can quietly become a substitute for closeness. Dr. Phil's authority came not only from education but from embodiment. He wasn't just advising relationships, he was proof that his advice worked. That identity made honesty complicated. Admitting personal struggle would have felt like professional collapse. When your life becomes evidence, vulnerability turns dangerous. Over time, the role followed him everywhere, including into his marriage. Conversations became measured. Disagreements softened before they fully formed. Not because conflict didn't exist, but because conflict threatened the image. Slowly, authenticity began negotiating with reputation, and reputation almost always won. Robin once famously said that they never yelled at each other. The statement became legendary, cited as proof that emotional maturity could eliminate conflict entirely. But silence does not automatically equal peace. In some relationships, raised voices are replaced not by understanding, but by restraint. Words go unspoken not because they are unnecessary, but because they feel unwelcome. Over time, emotional expression shrinks. Needs arrive pre-edited. What once felt calm begins to feel carefully controlled, and love becomes something you manage rather than experience. Long before Robin, there was another marriage, one rarely discussed and easily dismissed. As a young man, Phil married because momentum suggested it was the next step. Later, he described that relationship as ill-considered, lacking reflection or compatibility. It ended quietly, almost politely. But what mattered wasn't the ending. It was the lesson learned and never examined. Silence worked. Avoidance worked. Closure without confrontation felt efficient. That pattern would quietly repeat itself, refined but unresolved. Robin entered Phil's life at a moment when stability felt essential. She brought emotional steadiness, reassurance, and belief. Their relationship formed quickly and decisively, rooted in support and alignment. But relationships born from repair sometimes prioritize safety over vulnerability. From the beginning, theirs functioned smoothly, efficiently, almost structurally. As Phil's career expanded, the marriage evolved alongside it, not just as a partnership, but as a foundation for everything else he was building. As Dr. Phil's public presence grew, his marriage transformed into instruction. Robin wasn't hidden. She was visible, involved, reinforcing the narrative. Together, they spoke about communication, boundaries, and emotional safety. Their relationship wasn't simply lived, it was demonstrated. But when a marriage becomes a model, imperfection becomes unacceptable. There is no room for confusion, resentment, or doubt. Every struggle feels like a contradiction. Slowly, honesty becomes riskier than silence. They were rarely apart. This closeness was framed as devotion, and in many ways it was. But constant proximity can erode individuality. Space allows people to change, to reflect, to miss each other. Without it, growth feels disruptive. Over time, togetherness became routine rather than intentional. The marriage stayed intact, but curiosity faded. Being partners slowly replaced being lovers. Rumors followed them for years, rising and disappearing like background noise. They were never fully addressed, never fully denied. Silence became strategy. For a man who built his career on confronting uncomfortable truths, the absence of transparency felt conspicuous. But silence worked. It preserved the image. It protected the structure. And with every unanswered question, emotional distance quietly expanded. At one point, there was talk of Robin telling her story, fully, honestly, beyond inspiration. That story never appeared. No explanation followed, just absence. The silence suggested boundaries even she could not cross publicly. When truth becomes negotiable within a marriage, intimacy is already compromised. As their children grew and left home, a shared purpose disappeared. Parenting had provided direction, urgency, distraction. Without it, the marriage faced itself without buffers. There were no crises, no dramatic fights, just a growing awareness of how little emotional space remained unexplored. They lived together, traveled together, appeared together, but emotionally they drifted. Kindness remained, respect remained, but passion was replaced by predictability. What once felt like partnership became coexistence. The marriage didn't break, it hollowed. Dr. Phil spent decades asking others if they were truly happy. Eventually, the question turned inward, and the answer was uncomfortable. Happiness hadn't vanished, it had faded quietly, like a song playing too long in the background. Leaving isn't always the hard choice. Sometimes staying is. Staying protects routine, reputation, comfort. Leaving requires honesty. For Dr. Phil, honesty meant dismantling an image that millions trusted. The end did not arrive suddenly. It was the result of accumulated realizations. There was no scandal, no betrayal revealed at the end, only acknowledgement. What made the end of this marriage so difficult to understand for the public was the absence of a villain. There was no dramatic betrayal, no explosive revelation, no single moment that could be isolated and blamed. Instead, there was something far more unsettling: two people who had grown emotionally out of sync while remaining outwardly aligned. Dr. Phil and Robin did not stop respecting each other. They did not stop caring. But caring, when stripped of intimacy, slowly transforms into responsibility. And responsibility, while honorable, cannot sustain a marriage on its own. Their story challenges the comforting idea that marriages only end because someone does something wrong. Sometimes, they end because both people finally admit something quietly painful, that what once felt alive now feels preserved rather than lived. For most of his career, Dr. Phil framed relationships in terms of accountability, effort, and choice. Success meant staying and working through discomfort. Failure meant giving up too soon. But life has a way of humbling even the most confident frameworks. In his own marriage, effort had not disappeared. It had simply stopped producing connection. The realization that commitment alone could not restore emotional closeness forced him to redefine failure itself. Was it failure to leave after decades of loyalty, or was it failure to remain while pretending nothing had changed? That question lingered heavily, because answering it required letting go of the identity he had built as the man who always knew which choice was right. Dr. Phil had spent years telling guests that staying in a relationship out of fear, habit, or public expectations slowly erodes the soul. He warned that living in emotional dishonesty eventually creates resentment, even when there is no open conflict. Applying that wisdom to his own life was not empowering. It was devastating. It meant acknowledging that the marriage he had held up as proof of his philosophy was now asking him to practice the very advice that once felt theoretical. The irony was impossible to escape. The mirror he had held up to others was now turned inward, and for the first time, he could not look away. There is a comforting belief that knowledge protects us, that if we understand human behavior deeply enough, we can avoid its pitfalls. Dr. Phil's life quietly dismantled that illusion. Awareness did not prevent emotional distance. Insight did not guarantee intimacy. In fact, expertise sometimes made things harder because every feeling had to be analyzed, justified, or explained. The marriage did not collapse under ignorance. It slowly weakened under overstructure. Love became something managed instead of experienced. And that realization, that understanding does not equal immunity, was one of the most humbling lessons of his life. One of the most misunderstood aspects of long relationships is the belief that love either exists or it doesn't. In reality, love often changes shape long before it disappears. In Dr. Phil and Robin's case, love evolved into respect, gratitude, and deep familiarity. But familiarity, when unaccompanied by emotional discovery, can feel empty. They still cared about each other's well-being. They still wanted the best for one another. What they no longer shared was a sense of emotional aliveness. And recognizing that difference required honesty more painful than anger ever could be. When news of the separation surfaced, many people felt personally unsettled. Not because they knew the marriage, but because they had relied on it. The McGraw relationship had functioned as reassurance, proof that wisdom guaranteed permanence. Its end disrupted that belief. But what the public reacted to was not the reality of the marriage. It was the loss of an image. Images feel permanent because they don't change with time. Real relationships do. And the gap between those two truths became impossible to ignore. Despite decades in the public eye, the ending of the marriage was handled with restraint. There were no televised explanations, no emotional statements designed to control perception. This choice was deliberate. After years of living as symbols, Dr. Phil and Robin chose to reclaim something private. Protecting their children, grandchildren, and shared history mattered more than preserving an illusion. In a culture that demands access to every personal moment, withholding detail became a final act of autonomy. For the first time in his public life, Dr. Phil spoke without certainty. There were no definitive answers, no step-by-step conclusions, only reflection. He acknowledged that even decades of insight could not stop love from changing, and that endings do not always come with clarity. This version of him, less authoritative, more human, was unfamiliar to audiences. But it was also the most honest. Ending a marriage does not erase its meaning. 47 years contained growth, sacrifice, shared memory, and genuine partnership. Those years were not invalidated by their conclusion. They were completed. And understanding that difference matters because it reframes endings not as erasure, but as closure. What remained between them was not bitterness, but acknowledgement of what was real and what no longer was. Dr. Phil spent a lifetime helping others decide when to stay and when to let go, believing that clarity always followed effort. But life eventually presented him with a question that no framework could soften. Is continuing more honest than ending? His answer was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply real. And perhaps that is the most difficult truth of all, that sometimes ending a long marriage is not a failure of love, but the final expression of it.